Hi, this is Jimmy. Today we're talking about cellular respiration. Different than respiration that you think about taking place in your lungs, breathing in and out, although that does support cellular respiration. This is the respiration that happens in cells. In this video, I'm just going to give you an overview of the basic processes, and I'll give you more details in another one. So we said it takes place in the cell, and usually glucose, which I'm going to represent with these black beads, because we usually focus on the carbon. So the glucose is brought in and it's converted to ATP. So here's my model for ATP. Let's talk about that, because to me this is the important aspect of things. More so than the steps, what is actually happening? Well, glucose isn't turned into ATP. Glucose is energy that it carries in with the electrons in its bonds. It basically got these from sunlight, which was used in photosynthesis to charge up and put a bunch of energy in here. So now we have glucose with these yellow beads that represent high energy electrons. And the job of cellular respiration is to take these electrons off and run them through a series of processes and transfer that energy into ATP. All right, a little more about ATP itself. So ATP is a fairly large molecule. It's a nucleotide. And I've represented the phosphates with these little green stars. So here it has 3 of them, so it's ATP. If I take one off, then it's ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, with just 2 phosphates. And if I take another one off, then it's adenosine monophosphate, with just 1. Normally in your cell, you have a bunch of adenosine diphosphates floating around. You also have usually a pretty good abundance of these phosphate groups sitting there in the cell. And the job of cellular respiration is to control the chemical reactions, to bring the energy from this electron to ADP and allow it to add a phosphate and become ATP. So it's really just charging up ADP is what it's doing. It's not making ATP just out of thin air. It's just adding a phosphate. And this molecule can then be used to do work by popping that phosphate back off and transferring it to something else. ATP is the workhorse of the cell for most situations that we'll run into. All right, so the job of cellular respiration is to strip electrons off of glucose and use them to charge up ATP. Well, that's not done in one foul swoop. It's done in a variety of steps. The first step is glycolysis, and that happens here in the cytoplasm. It's really the only step that happens in the cytoplasm. And what we'll look at is what happens to glucose. So let's just track it simply. Glucose is a 6-carbon molecule, and during glycolysis, some of that energy is going to be siphoned off, and glucose is broken in half. All right, so we got a little bit of energy out of it, a couple ATPs, but not a whole lot else. For all the other steps, we're going to have to transfer these into the mitochondria. So I want to talk about the mitochondria a little bit before we move off of glycolysis. I'll set my pyruvates, those 3-carbon molecules, off to the side, and let's take a closer look inside the mitochondria. So here's the cell. Here's a mitochondrion. Notice, see how it's always wavy? Whenever you see a diagram of mitochondria and it looks like that, let's talk a little bit about that. If you look inside this membrane, here's that inner wavy membrane. It's studded with these proteins, and there's even more of them as well, but these are the ones that make most of your ATP. That one is known as ATP synthase, which makes sense. If I want to make a lot of ATP, I need a lot of these. But I don't want to give them much space because I need to fit a lot of those mitochondria in a little bitty cell. And so let's say I had this big membrane dotted with ATP synthase, but I wanted to fit it in a small space. Well, how do you do that? It's not damaged, they're still there. You wad it up, you wrap it up in another membrane, and now you have a mitochondria. Well, if you then were to cut that and look at it from the side, you'd see something a little like this. You have that outer membrane and this folded up membrane inside. That's what this is. Alright, so the next step that happens in here is the pyruvate comes into the mitochondria. It's kind of this big step that happens all at once. We get a little bit of energy off. One of those carbons leaves as carbon dioxide. These two that are stuck together are attached to another molecule called coenzyme A. And so now these two are acetyl. We've stuck them onto coenzyme A, so we've converted that to Acetyl-coA. And these are going to carry it to the next set of reactions. I'll set that one aside. So we've done glycolysis in the cytoplasm, acetyl-coA conversion in the mitochondria. Next we have the Krebs cycle, and there we're going to take that from coenzyme A, we're going to break them apart and strip off all those other electrons in the process. Let's bring those guys back. So we're taking off the rest of those electrons, transferring energy around. These can all leave as carbon dioxide. And now we're going to take those electrons, put them through this thing called the electron transport system, and create lots of ATP. As you might imagine, that involves these ATP synthase molecules, and then that's where most of our ATP comes from. That's going to be made by those, obviously not to scale. And so we can look at this process. They have to happen in order as a series of reactions, aerobic cellular respiration, where we take glucose, which is C6H12O6. We've not talked about oxygen, but we're going to need some oxygen. And we're going to chop that up into water and carbon dioxide. So far I've only addressed the glucose, which comes into glycolysis, and it comes out of acetyl-coA conversion as carbon dioxide. The rest of it comes out of the Krebs cycle as carbon dioxide. And what we've not addressed, we've addressed these two, oxygen and water. Oxygen is needed to accept those electrons in the electron transport system, and they are rearranged and used to form water, which is fairly neutral. We don't want to leave off of this the most important part. This set of reactions, chopping up glucose into smaller molecules, is not the purpose of aerobic cellular respiration. The purpose is to use this energy that is being given off in this process, those electrons, to drive the reaction to form ATP, this guy, out of ADP and the phosphates floating around in the cell. So again, the main point of all these steps is to make ATP. How that's done is a series of steps that happen one little bit at a time that strip off electrons and transfer them to ATP. There's an overview. Details to come.